Funding for the production of Public Square provided by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, working to improve the lives of vulnerable children.
Within special ed, we focus so much on the disability. We forget that these children also have identity.
It was a tremendous shock to us that the school didn't plan to educate our son. It seemed to me to be quite a surprise as a parent that not everybody shared my view that this child had incredible potential to be an incredible adult, and yet was sort of marginalized down to her disability.
She was left to rot in the back of the class, basically. She wasn't challenged, she wasn't given anything to do, they just kind of left her there.
And the struggle I encounter on a regular basis is being able to say, all right, I recognize she has all these problems. But you know what? If we raise the bar, she meets it every time.
The majority of our Native kids, they're not graduating. And to see parents cry before administrators and say that these services, and what can you do? They don't hear those cries.
Welcome to Public Square, where civic dialogue takes center stage.
People can't see what they don't believe. He's experienced that his whole life because people see a child in a chair who is severely physically disabled.
Today, we'll talk about improving the educational outcomes for students with special needs and disabilities. The graduation rates for this population in New Mexico persistently lags behind others, and proficiency rates in math and reading are alarmingly low in New Mexico's public schools. These statistics impact all of us when these students are unable to find long-term employment. We'll meet parents of students with special needs and hear about the difficulties in navigating a complex system to ensure their kids get what they legally deserve and reach their full potential. We'll also meet special education teachers and learn about the challenges they face to ensure their students succeed. After that, we'll explore solutions for making these outcomes better with Senator Jerry Ortiz-Pino, Representative Jim Smith, and Suzanne Starr, principal of Shining Stars School in Rio Rancho. Before we get started, here's a little bit more about our topic.
There's a human face behind all of these stories. It's not just a number, a kid who costs a lot to the district.
New Mexico is struggling to raise graduation rates and the proficiencies of all students in math and reading. But students with special needs face even greater challenges. Federal legislation, including the Individuals with Disability Education Act, is supposed to ensure that students with special needs get a free and appropriate education. Yet the rates of graduation for this group lag other students. When it comes to proficiency ratings on math and reading, the gap is much wider. Their parents often struggle to find the resources their kids need to achieve their full potential. Many have evolved into advocates who help other parents fight for children's rights within the educational system.
We have to get back to this place where we really sense that our voice and who we are as people in a community is vital to speak for those who can't, and that's the children.
Statewide, students in special education, which includes those with disabilities and those who are gifted, number 45,000, about 14% of all those enrolled in public schools. In Albuquerque public schools, they make up about 16% of the student population.
For us as teachers, we really want to make sure that kids have a chance to succeed at whatever level they are and try to improve those outcomes.
Our expectation as parents is that she will be a contributing member of society, and for her to achieve that, she needs a lot of support along the way. But she deserves equal opportunity to be able to learn in the classroom. I think that if we continue to raise the bar, then they do better. Not challenging them at the right level is one of the biggest opportunities for failure that we have.
Many parents are worried their children with special needs will not graduate, and that makes them fearful for their children's futures once they leave the education system. Unemployment rates for those with disabilities is consistently higher than those without.
What are we giving to these children when they do drop out? And where's their place? Because I can tell you, prisons are really defining a place for them, and that's where they're going.
If we don't invest in them now, if we don't plan for what their needs are now, then we will be spending a lot more financially long term, and we won't have the best outcomes for them to be successful and be contributing members of society.
I really hope that what can happen is that we raise the level of compassion inside of people so that they recognize that it's not an isolated issue. This impacts everybody.
I'd like to start out with you, Katie. If you could talk about the challenges you have faced with having a child with special needs and getting what she needs to learn in the school system.
I have a daughter who has cerebral palsy. She's fairly mildly affected. So we're spared some of the issues that are involved with more challenged kids who have greater disabilities. But my daughter has epilepsy, which means she has recurrent regular seizures, which is a tremendous worry for parents. When she first started out in public school, we were in this beautiful bubble of early intervention, which New Mexico does really well in Albuquerque public schools. And then we moved into kindergarten, and we were very blessed. We got an excellent teacher, and she was given an aide in the classroom after a lot of lobbying on our part to make that happen. And then things changed. We attempted to do mainstream education with her for first grade, and it was a disaster. Within a month, she was completely isolated from the rest of her class, literally seated in another part of the same room where all the kids were in a little rainbow arc, and my daughter was in a desk at the back of the room facing the back wall. And this was a child who was fluently reading, which was beyond all of her peers in first grade, and clearly had natural aptitude for a lot of academic work, but she wasn't given it. She was put in a special education classroom with a lot of other children who had different kinds of disabilities. It was later we learned that all along she had qualified for gifted education. But none of these things were told to us. And to learn that there were all of these special accommodations available if we knew how to ask for them was frustrating. It seemed to me to be quite a surprise as a parent that not everybody shared my view that this child had incredible potential to be an incredible adult, and yet was sort of marginalized down to her disability. And as the years went on, she was further and further alienated from other kids. So we have ultimately given up on public school and started our own school program for our daughter. It called for extreme steps. She had been sent home from school 38 times. Only one was documented in her special education folder.
My daughter is gifted, but she also has a mathematics disorder. So in third grade, she could not learn her times tables or her basic math facts. But APS in high school has a twice exceptional program, and my daughter's strength is in English and language arts, and she has absolutely thrived. She just took the SAT in 9th grade, and she scored at the 99th percentile nationally.
Was it easy to find that program?
Oh, it was impossible. I found out from word of mouth. If you do a Google search, you won't find anything. If you check the APS website, you won't find anything. And it's really a shame because I think what is happening is they're taking kids and allowing them to fail in high school before ever trying the twice exceptional program. And the thing is the kids who are twice exceptional are not going to thrive in regular education. The one strength that I have always had going for my daughter is that she loves to learn and she loves school. And it honestly has been a fight through the years to keep her feeling that way. So when we found out about the program, we tried it, and I feel like they have given my daughter the chance to graduate and to still be eligible for the lottery scholarship and the other things. And for the first time in her life, she really feels successful.
How did you get to this point where you found before you could find the twice exceptional program, what were the biggest challenges?
In 7th grade, her teacher really felt like she was gifted and requested testing. And APS lost the paperwork. And after a year and a half, it was almost 2 years, before I had a fit and really worked on getting testing. But APS is the first school district I've ever worked with that doesn't feel like it's important for administration or people in the testing to return phone calls or emails or things like that. So it was really difficult to get her through the testing process to get her the services that she needed. And I think that's really a shame because the teachers that we have found in APS have honestly been the best teachers that my children have ever had in the nation. If the school district portion and the portion that is outside of the teacher's control could just get it together, you'd have a really good education system.
What impact did it have on her you were sort of in a limbo for a couple of years?
Well, her 8th grade year, she spent 2 hours in language arts doing her own thing. She would bring in 2 or 3 other books that maybe she had already read and just she was left to rot in the back of the class, basically. So she got nothing from that year of school, and I just think a mind is a terrible thing to waste. They would have been better off to have pulled her out of that class and given her additional time for math or something else. Socially, it definitely impacted her because it kind of put her into a habit of being in her own world and socially isolated and removed.
Stephanie, what have you experienced? Is it similar to this?
My son has cerebral palsy as well. He is actually very severely affected by it. He speaks with a very complicated computer system using a switch with his right leg. He does not have any intellectual disabilities. He has severe physical disabilities. In New Mexico, our 0 to 3 program is really phenomenal and strong program. But when my son was, once he turned 3, they didn't have the continuation programs that Paula represents, the 3 to 5. And so associated services, any kind of educational moving skills forward were not available to him. So that was sort of we're going along and all of a sudden we did a face plant.
Can you explain just briefly what the Iep process is? Because I don't know if people understand. This is something parents with kids with special needs go through every year.
It's a really important tool for parents of children with special needs, and actually every student in special education is required to have an IEP.
Individualized education plan.
Yes,
okay.
And it is in fact a legally binding document, and that's important for people to understand because it makes, ideally, the school and the family mutually accountable for the education of this child. And I think that that's a really important partnership that gets framed as an adversarial relationship. And I think that's one of the problems as we talk about how do we address these issues. One of the key issues that we have faced as a family is trying to communicate to educators the expectations that Marceliano holds for himself and the expectations that we as his family hold for him. And he actually said it the best in his transition. It's a packed room. For all of you who have gone through IEPs, it can be tense. And he said, people can't see what they don't believe. And a woman sitting there said, oh, yeah, you got to see it to believe it. And he said, no. People can't see what they don't believe. He's experienced that his whole life because people see a child in a chair who is severely physically disabled. And as young parents, we were shepherded into an ISP program. Didn't know there were we didn't know there was anything else available.
And what is that, an ISP?
Intensive services program within APS. And he was not able to go to his home school, so all of his neighborhood friends, the kids that he rode his adapted trike with, they all went to one school and he went to another one with an ISP program out in the portables. And it was a tremendous shock to us that that the school didn't plan to educate our son.
What did you do?
Well, it's a process. Marcel was an ISP student for all of his elementary. The school where he was worked with us as I'd have to say as their capacity developed, because we believed that Marceliano needed to be with all the other students. We didn't have a concept that separate but equal still existed. It was a shock to us. So there was a process that ensued, and a lot of it was our maturation as advocates, finding out about what existed, finding out that there was assistive technology that would help him speak. And there were many wonderful professionals within the schools that helped us with that. And there were many people who completely rejected the idea that Marceliano should be with his typically developing peers. And I'm not making up these stories. We sat in a teacher meeting one time where the teacher held up an example of his writing, a story about deer by a lake, and said to me with all earnestness, he doesn't write at school. Right? And I'm looking at her and I said, so I don't understand, what do you have in your hand? That wasn't what he was supposed to write about. Right? Right, and we can chuckle, but I'm faced with a situation where a teacher is telling me your child can't be in a general education classroom because I can't see his ability to learn. And that's a deeply challenging position to be faced with as a parent. And can you imagine what it's like for Marceliano to be faced with that? To have this understanding that the world, by and large, sees him in a way that's not at all accurate. We finally worked with APS. We brought him back to his home school. He's in majority general ed classes. And I wish I could play for you the video of him receiving his honor roll certificate.
What are you looking forward towards graduation, towards transitioning out of school?
Graduation, right. There isn't a way for my son to graduate with a diploma.
Why not?
Currently. Because my son has a cortical visual impairment, which means that he doesn't read visually, and he has cerebral palsy, so he doesn't braille. So he listens to all his books. It's all audio, or somebody reading to him, which is fine, and then he responds to the text in that way. The SBA, as it's currently framed, the state benchmark assessment, and for graduation with a diploma of excellence, which is the standard diploma in the state of New Mexico, requires certain cut scores in all of the SBA areas. Marcel can't test in reading, so he has no way to take a reading assessment currently, so he has no way to receive a diploma. When he discovered this, he was furious. And this is a student who's dead set on going to college and will. We just don't know how we're going to make it work yet.
Caroline, you're a parent, but you're also on the board of Parents Reaching Out. Why is this such a complicated process to get your kids what they need?
Parents Reaching Out is an organization we often abbreviate called PRO, but the goal is to help parents maneuver through systems so that they can be empowered and be able to be advocates for their children. And my daughter has cerebral palsy and cortical vision impairment and a myriad of other issues that we contend with. And as a family, we find balance. But then to have to struggle with a system that requires us to continually debate what our child needs. We want our daughter to be a contributing member of society. And getting a high school degree is going to be important for her to be able to do that. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that if I can't be an equal partner at the table when we go to meetings, then it's very difficult to assure that she will meet her full potential. And the struggle I encounter on a regular basis is being able to say, all right, I recognize she has all these problems, but you know what? If we raise the bar, she meets it every time.
Ronalda, what are the challenges for Native American parents?
Our children all want opportunities and choices. They want to go on and be citizens of their communities so that they have a voice. And within the Native population, it's a silent voice, and it has been for a long time. Within special ed, we focus so much on the disability, we forget that these children also have identity. And by the time these children get to high school, they have no identity. And that's one thing with my own son. When we moved here 5 years ago, we were in Colorado for a majority of their elementary and middle school years, and then we moved here to APS. But they wouldn't test him for gifted. He was gifted in Colorado. We crossed the state line, and he's no longer gifted. And so we're thinking, well, why? And then to eventually find out his GPA fell to 1.7. Then he went through depression. And then I was like, what am I going to do? Because they're not putting him in a program that he needs to be in. And so then it took me 5 months to advocate for that and finally say, you know what, you're going to do this. Because now you got a child who is depressed. So eventually we got it done, we got him tested, and then by the start of his sophomore year, kid's GPA 3.5. And he always says to Mom, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be where I am. And it's a sad story, really sad, because the majority of our Native kids, they're not graduating. And to see parents cry before administrators and say that these services, and what can you do, they don't hear those cries. You know, it's hard to understand at times, but and then sometimes I really see the racism. I see that so profoundly with our special needs children, because we don't look at the issues of getting past skin color and then really seeing the disability, then seeing the giftedness beyond that. We're still looking at these stereotypes and whether these children can make it. Because my son, when we moved down here, he says, Mom, in all the places we lived, Washington, D.C., Colorado, he said, I was never told that I was, one, a Native American, that I was going to either turn into a drunk, that I wasn't going to make it, I was lazy, and I was unmotivated. This is the place where I've heard those stories. And he said, nobody ever told me that. And so when I heard that, I was like, well, we're still doing that today. We're still doing that in our societies and in our schools. And it's so unfair.
Well, we also have teachers here. Can I get an idea of the kinds of challenges you guys are facing on the other side?
I think the most important piece of philosophy that you have to have is that the parents are your allies. The advocates are your allies. I didn't always think that when I was teaching special ed. It used to be scary to me when an advocate would come in. But as I learned and I matured myself, I learned that they have ideas. They have things that are going to help me help this student. And as I learned as an administrator to work with these advocates and these parents, the most important thing is the child. And what is the child's goals and what do they want to accomplish in the world. And when I hear some of these stories, it's appalling to me, it's offensive to me. That shouldn't happen. When you look at Robert F. Kennedy Charter School, have we made mistakes? Of course we have. But you know what? We've worked with the parents. The relationship with the parent and the student is very strong. If I make a mistake, I fix it. If I need the parent, I call them and ask them, and we work together as a team. And when you talk about IEP meetings and team meetings, they are very important. They're often very scary. They can be tense. But the most important thing that we all have to remember is, why are we doing this? For the child.
You are teaching in classes like most teachers.
Sure.
You have general ed kids and special ed kids.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the challenges in that kind of situation, making sure everybody's getting what they need, and also the challenges in terms of your resources, training as teachers?
There's a couple of things. In a regular classroom setting, we have a full inclusion model for Bernalillo Public Schools in the middle school where I work. And we have a lot of special ed mainstreamed right into the classroom with the other students. I teach social studies. Social studies is not tested by the state at this level. So, of course, we will not get support in the classroom unless we have a fair number of students requiring one-on-one assistance in that classroom. And even then, it can be difficult.
You don't get support because it's not tested?
Yes, that's pretty much it. If you're nodding your head, and that's because it's true. Okay? I mean,
right.
it is. If it's not tested, it isn't as important. And that is a fact of life of modern education right now. So fortunately, I'm special ed certified. I know a lot of the accommodations that need to be made. Not all teachers have that training. And when I'm working in a classroom and I've got maybe 20% of the classroom, or in some classes, not mine, 30% special ed in a classroom, that becomes an inclusion classroom more for regular ed students. And it means I also can't reach those kids that need that one-on-one. But if you're doing the regular classroom teaching, which is what I'm doing, I'm there as a regular ed teacher, you really need to be able to balance the kinds of ways of learning to the students that you have, and it's not always an easy task.
Paul, I want to ask about, you're at the other end of the spectrum.
Nationally, 13 to 16% of children ages birth through 5 were being diagnosed or labeled with a disability, but we are serving 3 to 5%. So I think the challenge is, when you look at that dramatic deficit number, is there's a lot of children that aren't getting services that they need.
And what's the impact later on when they get to high school?
That's exactly my point, is that they need that early intervention when they are from birth. This is a continuum, and I think that's where my piece is so important.
She talked about falling off the cliff.
Yeah.
At 3 to 5, what are you guys doing differently?
It's a classroom setting, which is 0 to 3 is usually in-home services. I don't know if that's something that Stephanie would receive. So the therapist would go into the home and work with the child and the parent on skills that they need and things like that. And then from 3 to 5, it's a classroom setting. We do like play groups, and the physical therapist is there, the occupational therapist is there, the speech language therapist is there. So not only when they come from the early intervention programs into our school, they go from our school into kindergarten. That's the next step. And so we have kindergarten teachers coming into our school, observing the children in the classroom. They know the ins and outs of the child. We've already talking about that dialogue's going on about what their needs are and how they will get met in the next transitional phase for them in kindergarten.
Veronica, what did you try to accomplish during your tenure that you feel is left unfinished? Because we're hearing a lot of challenges here.
I think our goal at the department was to have less due process hearings and less of these conflicts by providing more training to school districts. What's interesting here is you have a pretty much of a metropolitan representation of parents and teachers and so on. We forget that New Mexico is a very rural state, and you can imagine what it's like when you consider that half of the school districts in New Mexico are less than 1,000 students, and a quarter of them have less than 250 students. So when you have a child with special needs in these very rural areas of the state, being able to really meet the needs of those children becomes an even greater challenge. And I think we as educators need to personalize it with each situation, not think of them as a number, but think of the real human being that's in front of you, and how can you think creatively out of the box to meet the needs of those children. And I think it's difficult for general education teachers that have more and more pressure about student performance and outcomes and test results and the grading of your school to focus on then how can we creatively meet the needs of these individual children. And there has to be that balance. I'm all for accountability, but we also have to recognize that parents are the number one expert of their children. And I think that if you can have that open communication, parents also begin to trust a little bit more. And if you can really partner, because when the trust breaks down, the communication breaks down, what happens? The litigation goes up, the cost goes up, and the money that's spent on litigation could best be spent on services to kids.
What could change that would make this better?
Those transition points, they seem to be so disruptive.
They're huge.
And they're huge. And how, so maybe from a policy perspective, whether there needs to be an ombudsman of some sort or someone within a district that is really focusing on these transition pieces.
I also think that sometimes we look at funding and money, and we look at teachers and administrators who need training. But my perspective on all of this is, what are the constants? What are the constants within our schools? What are the constants within our communities? And the constants within our schools are parents. They're never changing. They're always moving from one grade to the next. And the children are never changing. They're the ones that keep going and flowing. So we really need to look at how are we putting funding toward training parents and making sure they get what they need, so when administrators change, teachers change, that at least there's a constant.
But we also have to remember that you've got some wonderful parents here who are amazing advocates for their children and have, either the resources or the time to be able to do that. Not all special education children have parents that are either educated or that may want to, but because of work schedules can't, or they have their own issues that they can't advocate for their children. And those children are facing a double whammy because then who advocates for them?
At Albuquerque Public Schools, if you look at Winston Brooks' executive team, the special education director is not on his team. And so that sort of top-down view of where does special education belong is very clear. The other piece about this, and this is a funding piece, is that
we get funds from the federal government to meet the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act requirement. And that act came out of another act called FAPE, which is that every child in the United States is entitled to a free and appropriate public education. That's appropriate is the key word.
I will say before we break that APS was invited to participate in the show, and this particular time around they declined. But we're going to bring in leadership now from the state level, and we can talk about what are some possible solutions, and we'll be back in a minute.
Do we get to stand up and stretch for a second?
Yes, you do.
Are we stuck to this?
Or do we?
Our leadership, who is here, had the opportunity to sit and listen to all of you talk before, so I'm just going to throw out a general question to you. If something sparked any ideas you have on how we might address some of these problems at the state level, at the local level?
These sound like problems that can be solved legislatively. Stephanie said that they don't test reading in SBA for people that can't hear, right?
He's not able to take it visually or Braille, and so they're not allowing him to listen to it.
Oh, they're not allowing it. So isn't that something we could do with the NMSBA and allow that to be?
Well, I think that it's a fundamental issue in that the test is testing the ability to read, and since the child is unable to actually read it, you can't measure it. But it would seem that there would be some way via the IEP in this kind of situation to have a waiver process or something. When will your child graduate?
He's in 6th grade now.
So we have time. I mean, there are children with even, greater disabilities that cannot take the SBA that graduate on a diploma. This particular child really wants to graduate on a diploma.
The high school diploma is something that is so valuable in terms of what that opens up for students, and having that expectation and a pathway to get one is a really important thing.
It's a good idea to have the state has 3 diplomas, is that right? Am I saying that right?
I guess you can graduate an IEP and a standard diploma.
Standard diploma, a career, and then also an ability.
Because I gather we're one of the few states that has those.
Yes.
Yep.
We do. Because
is it a good thing?
I recall when I was in Colorado, we had some kids who came from New Mexico to Colorado, and they had no idea how to, one, take credits that you didn't earn. It was confusing. So that when you leave the state and go to another state that doesn't look at those 3 options, it does make it confusing.
I think it was intended to create more flexibility.
I would agree with you because it helps individualize that student's transition needs. Maybe they want to go into the workforce. Maybe they're interested in welding. And maybe their skills are with their hands and not with reading. That gives the teacher, the educators, the ability to individualize that career path, that educational path to help that student meet his goals of graduating, more importantly, entering the workforce.
But the downfall in that is the way we get the information out, because I can tell you there's not enough parents. I just had a parent yesterday come to me. They have a graduating senior next week, and they had no idea she was on an ability diploma.
And what does that mean for them?
Well, there's conditions also based on these diplomas.
And they're not accepted. The only at UNM, for instance, the diploma they recognize is the standard diploma of excellence, and PED will say there is one diploma we issue in this state. The other diplomas or a certificate of attendance is not accepted at any, continuing education if that's the path that the student wants to take.
But technically you don't even need a diploma to go to college. What you have are your entrance exams and the courses you take. And I think that's important for people to know that.
And see, that's where parents don't understand that. Because this particular parent with their daughter wanted to go into C&M and wanted to do early childhood. And then when I was talking to them, I said, did you get her tested? Did you take ACTs? And that was a big problem with the transition plan. It wasn't created to where they were looking at what is the goals of this child. Instead, it's looking at the disability and what she's incapable of doing. So then they decided for her that this is the path she needs to take, instead of really looking at what are her dreams and what are her intents. And so
it goes back to transitions that we were talking about earlier, how critical those pieces are. all the way through.
But it also goes back to the information not being disseminated when it needs to be disseminated. And so, for example, a bill was passed in the legislature a year ago requiring every individualized education plan of a student with autism to consider 11 factors, 11 interventions. It must be present at every IEP of a child with autism. That was passed by the legislature. Sadly, our governor pocket vetoed it. However, it was mandated into law through the PED regulations. Why couldn't we do something similar when it comes to transition planning? That these items must be discussed at the transition from middle school to high school. And one of those would be, obviously, graduation requirements.
Can that be addressed, though, in the 4-year plan? That's required?
Yes, it can, and also a lot of the charter schools are using the PED's IEP. And the PED's Public Education
when you say
Department.
that, the Public Education Department has a standard individual education plan.
And in there is the transition piece is huge. It's one of the most important pieces of that IEP for a student entering high school and transitioning out of high school.
But APS doesn't use that?
No.
They have their own form.
And see, that's the problem. Districts get to choose or create or do their own form, but they have to include the standard. The elements have to be there. But going to IEPs all over the state, it varies. And then within our community, you have BIE, you have tribal schools, the Bureau of Indian Education. Then you have tribal schools, and then you also have the community. You have public schools within, and these guidelines. And so it's different when it comes to the Native population because you have all these schools that exist in one community.
And they move back and forth.
Yes, they transition.
Which is also
I was struck by how incredibly successful the parents who spoke were, but how almost accidental was their success. It just seems to me that if our successes are going to be happenstance like that, we're not going to have very many of them. We really need to do much more about getting the information to the parents in an appropriate way. And I really, you'd mentioned just very quickly the possibility of ombudsman. And if we're serious about helping the parents become the vehicles for advocating for their children, then we really ought to be doing something about funding ways in which they can do exactly that. And maybe this would be a direction that we ought to be looking at as well.
And I wonder, to piggyback on that, Senator, you mentioned that some of the parents did, that you checked the website and you couldn't find certain programs that existed or services that were there. And so maybe that might be a requirement, that this array of programs or services that are available in a district be made available on the website, so that, or somehow accessible for parents to know what's there.
The idea of a navigator or an ombudsman or somebody that really, as you parents have become so adept at figuring out what's out there, sharing that information with other parents and a formalized way of doing that, so that we don't have so many that just drop through the cracks.
Our kids are 1 or 2 years away from pretty significant diagnoses, so their parents are really looking for help, and we're learning about these children, and many of our children have severe disabilities, not all, and so that partnership just develops. So the natural things that occur in the early years, how can we replicate that in mid-school, in high school?
One of the things that struck me, too, is that you have groups of parents that are advocates, and they all learn all of this stuff, and it's very active, but it's not ongoing. So it has to be systematized in terms of the training, that it is available for parents at the various juncture points.
I will say, although New Mexico has been my most difficult state to get my kids where they need to be in the programs they need to be in, it has also been probably the best in terms of the services that you provide. I had never heard of the Twice Exceptional program, and so I'm sorry if I'm awfully excited about it, but it's a program that works, and it's a program that I believe it was developed here at UNM, and other states have started to adopt it and use it. And the whole concept of getting kids through so that they can graduate and can go to college and do it quickly before they fail, to me, I'm having a hard time seeing how that's more expensive than watching them fail and drop out. You do some things so well, you should tell everybody about them.
Well, and one other thing that's a natural place to disseminate this information is that every student in special education has to have their 3-year evaluation. And when we entered special education, that came about when she was about 3 years old, and there was enormous testing done on every area of her body and her mind. And in that meeting, information was withheld. I was not told she was already tested in the gifted range, for example. In fact, I went through years of begging for testing later, only to find out that all the testing was done.
Did they say why it was withheld? Or not sure?
Because you know why? It is the most ridiculous thing in the world. Nobody ever really read her evaluation. That is the reality. And except for one person who because of word of mouth, I had heard there's this one evaluation specialist at APS that was the best. And I found him, and I begged to have him review my child's file. And he proceeded to tell me she was qualified for twice exceptional education. She had been in gifted category all along. And we had been begging, and we had also had the same situation where paperwork disappeared. It would have been cheaper for APS to just tell me what was available than to go through the dozens of meetings I ended up requiring them to go to, explaining to me why we couldn't get an appropriate placement for my child.
If we had something like an ombudsman program, does that require more funding? Does it require shifting of resources?
But I can't think of any way that would be more effective of putting some additional resources in place that wouldn't have the impact for the kids. If their parents really were exposed to all the options and what programs were available.
I think over time, individual teachers have been given the responsibility to chair IEP meetings, and I think it's asking a lot for teachers to really know the array of programs, the array of services that are there.
When we do initial IEPs, we always have a diagnostician there to do the interpretation of the results. We have the site specialist, that's what we use. It might be head teacher in other places. I mean, it's actually a lot of people at the table. You try to limit the school side so the family, isn't overwhelmed.
Yes,
but
you need to bring as much family as you can to increase your
right.
your equality at the table.
And then this brings it back to the table with rural versus urban, because I can tell you in the rural communities, no, it's already preset, the IEP is already written, they just want 15 minutes, parents, you just sign it right here and you be on your way. And there's no discussion made. And then I see that more even with parents who don't have that voice, and don't know what their rights are and how they can advocate for the system.
Does that feel true to you, or are you being asked to do
my IEPs have a start time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And I would like to educate the parents as much as I can, and if I can, I make sure someone at the table who is there. Like I said, it goes down to the relationship, it goes down to communication, it goes down to being able to listen. Silly as it may be, it's emotional intelligence. I know it is common sense, so I mean.
Are you going to say, Paula?
Yeah, even if an IEP is 4 hours long, there's only so much that you can really take in. And if you're going over the whole individualized education plan and then going over placements and programs for your child, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming for a teacher, it's overwhelming for a parent, and everybody on the board. So I think that's the main key here, is that communication ongoing.
Yep.
The whole
so outside the IEP process.
Yes, the dialogue has to take place all the time.
It is, and I can tell you as an advocate, when I get a call and the school knows I'm coming, the parents get the red carpet treatment.
It's true, but it shouldn't be true.
No, it shouldn't be that way.
Because the advocates are a great thing to
problem
have.
with IEP meetings, so that I've witnessed over the years, and it bothers me, is that they have this gigantic meeting, they invite everybody there, and it's legal document, and we're going to do this, this, and this, and you, in our case, don't know the child. So you get a child, and it says, in many cases, oh my gosh, these medical things, he's not going to walk, he's not going to talk, he's not going to do anything. And then, 3 months later, he's telling you a knock-knock joke, and you're like, oh my gosh, this IEP, what do I do? And it's absolutely true. It happens over and over again. And so what we're trying to do at Shining Stars is the addendums and say, we don't know your child now. Can you give us some time to know him?
I've been in a range of types of IEPs. But the interesting thing that I see is that sometimes it's the tone that the school sets for the IEP. If I go into one school, I was in some incredible IEPs with APS, where we had detailed information. I knew my kid really well. I knew exactly how to document his own needs in that IEP. So the thing was is that parent knew I knew the kid.
Mm-hmm.
And we developed the IEP with everybody involved, not just pre-done before it gets there. And it usually turned out to the kid's benefit. It was something that really was organic and worked at that time. But I've been at other IEPs. It was pre-done, and all they wanted was my signature, as you indicated.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, I actually went to an IEP and I said, no, I can't sign it. Why not? Well, you can't sign it because I had no input into it. You already wrote it.
Is that something that's changeable in policy?
It's a school.
It's more of a practice. I think.
Can you legislate practice?
No, you can't. But I really do believe it's a snapshot in time. You take, these kids take these tests under these conditions, and then there's the reality of how the child actually performs. Mm-hmm. And, I don't think that this should just be cast in concrete. But after, say, 6 weeks or a couple of months,
Mm-hmm.
To be able to revisit it if we feel like, not wait for that whole year.
And I think parents don't understand also that, a school has an annual IEP, but a parent can call an IEP as many times as they want.
But so many times parents are told,
no,
you can't
call
an
do
IEP.
that.
And there's and that is a huge issue that you could legislate, which is the following of IDEA laws by everyone. And that doesn't just include the administrator who says, no, you're not due for your IEP till April. You can't have
federal law.
It is the big law. But it includes every single adult working with every single child with special needs to understand what that law is. And a huge issue right now that's about to come to a lawsuit, another waste of New Mexico tax dollars to fight a ridiculous problem, which is that our bus company in Albuquerque Public Schools does not train any of the bus drivers in the federal law of IDEA. So a child with special needs, my child with special needs, got on the bus and was immediately told, she was told her assigned seat was here. She was not allowed to speak to any other students. She was not allowed to touch her bag. Now, do you know what the federal law is for ADA about people with disabilities? Can I make a restriction on your child because he's in a wheelchair that I don't have on my child because she's not? Of course not. That's against federal law. And yet our bus company is doing it every single day. And APS, it's a contracted arrangement.
This is true for many schools. Their buses are contracted.
All the APS buses are contracted through a
Any
North Carolina company, which I would question our legislature. Why do you think it's okay for bus companies to be contracted out of state? And then why are these adults allowed to work with our children, violate their federal law, their rights as a citizen to equal protection under the law? Children with special needs, as you were explaining, don't go to their home school. They're sheltered into other programs, so they're bused. Some children spend an hour and a half each way to go to school in the morning. That makes no sense, and you could legislate that. You could demand that every school has every adult trained in the federal laws.
Katie, how do you think this impacts the outcomes for these kids in terms of graduation?
Megan, can you imagine starting your day off going to school and the first thing you're told is you're not allowed to talk, you're not allowed to do anything? My daughter did not want to ride the bus. She did not want to be on that bus. It was a hostile environment for her.
And they set their own rules. It's another thing. The bus company sets their own rules versus the school. So then the school, if there's a fight or anything happening on the bus driver implements whatever they want to put into their own violation.
The bus company has their own rules?
Oh, yeah. They have their own rules. And when you get into the rural communities with native populations, they travel a huge miles to get to school.
If we're coming to the end of our time, what could we do now?
I have a question about your transition forms that you talked about, that yours are different than PED's forms. I mean, is that something that should be...
The state IEP form.
Yeah, the state.
A very big piece of it is about transition indicator 13. What is the student?
It's standardized throughout the state, so it's not an APS form.
I have a strong feeling about that and have had a lot of discussion with APS in their special ed because they use the term segregated location, which is an offensive term to many families.
Sure.
It's not used in the state IEP forms, nor should it be used, nor should it be put into practice. Using those state forms alleviates some of the languaging problems, but it also gives parents a uniform tool that they can begin to learn and understand this is what is involved, even for a parent to understand at the age 14 that they're entitled to transition services. Mm-hmm. Many parents, this is the information problem that we're talking about, the power of information. If you use forms that are actually educational, it would be, because every year you have to go to this meeting, and this would be a powerful way to communicate with parents, because, you know, unlike some situations, the parents that I've talked to, they do try and get through those IEP forms. Not that they're understanding APSs all the time, but they do want to know, what are they saying about my kid? What does this mean?
Rather than calling more IEP meetings, we could perhaps spend a little bit more time with professional development with the teachers, the administrators, families all together. We used to have just a room with coffee set up for parent groups, because we really realized at our school in the very beginning that our parents knew a lot more about dealing with little kids with severe disabilities than we did, and they were under a lot of stressors. So while the kids were in school, they had a room where they could support each other. That's more important to me than getting another person to come in and get hired.
But I think you can get some parents involved in getting the training and training other parents. I don't think this has to be something that you pay for. And I have a master's degree. I'm capable of doing more than photocopying. And I think a lot of times in New Mexico there's a perception that the parents really don't know much. I think that's not really true.
I think, you know, it goes back to the relational aspect of it, from the state level down to the district level, of being able to work collaboratively with these parent organizations and the professional educators, so that you're communicating and working together when it's not a point of contention right at an IEP meeting. You know what I mean?
Well, we talk about education funding and how we don't have enough money to fund education more. And in APS, it's something like every student, not special ed student, but every mainstream student brings into the district something like $6,600, something around that. Well, you know, the tuition at Albuquerque Academy is almost $20,000 per student. Now, why? Are they just furnishing their grounds? No, because they believe that's what it costs to educate a student. Maybe we haven't looked in the long picture of how much we've really raised the funding per student versus how much things cost in a 21st century economy.
But the money needs to be invested wisely, and if we just give the money to the school district, it may or may not result in a better outcome. You know, there's a certain group of kids that are going to make it through no matter what we do, and then there's a group of kids that are kind of on the edge, and I think helping tip the balance kind of in their favor can make a huge impact.
Unfortunately, there's not an approach in the state of New Mexico that I see that is addressing that. Across the board, multiple studies across, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well, say if you don't look at low socioeconomic status communities, then you are not getting the job done. And you can locate those communities and put targeted interventions into those communities.
Where do you focus the spending?
Right.
That was exactly the idea behind the constitutional amendment that didn't get out of Senate Finance Committee by a single vote this last year, but that would...
What would it have done, Jerry?
That would take an additional amount out of the severance tax and the permanent fund and spend it on education. Instead of investing in corporate stocks and bonds, we'd be investing in our kids.
Focus on early childhood education.
And it would all be focused on early childhood and the transition.
Which you get $18 back for every dollar invested.
Far better investment than investing in the bonds.
I want to say that if we want to increase outcomes for students in special needs, I think we have to honestly look at the issue of relationships and trust. And if there is an intent for that, I think we really need to take an honest look at whether we have the intent to educate students in special education to the best of their ability.
Thank you so much for participating. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's really important for me to support my son's dreams, for him to be able to graduate high school and go on to whatever he chooses. It's really important for me as a mom that I be able to give that to him.
It was a little heartbreaking to hear that parents are still struggling. I think one of the key things is that we all have to work together, and that there has to be lots of communication, and there has to be places for that to take place, not just an IEP meeting. It has to be ongoing.
Two things that I'd like to work on specifically are that whole thing around graduation or requirements that make it impossible for kids who, for physical or other reasons, can't read, for them to be able to graduate from high school. And then the second thing would be some way to finance this effort at getting parents to be able to navigate the system more effectively. I mean, it doesn't do a whole lot of good to have a parent liaison who can make a great pot of coffee, but who doesn't know the special ed system.
The risk we run of letting students drop out, letting students